My name is Sarah Elizabeth Henderson, and at 68 years old, I sit in my pottery studio in the Blue Ridge Mountains, shaping clay between my weathered hands. The morning light streams through windows, illuminating ceramic birds on every shelf. Chickadees, wrens, sparrows, each one a testament to survival. But today, I'm not thinking about beauty. I'm thinking about shadows, basement shadows, that held secrets too terrible for a child's mind to comprehend. I'm telling this story because somewhere out there, another child might be living the same nightmare I survived. They need to know that monsters can be defeated, that voices matter, and that even broken spirits can learn to sing again. It was 1963, and I lived in Millbrook, Kentucky, population 847. The kind of small town where everyone knew everyone's business, where church attendance was mandatory, and where reputation mattered more than truth. Our house on Maple Street looked like a Norman Rockwell painting, white clapboard siding, black shutters. My mother repainted every spring, a wraparound porch where neighbors commented on what a perfect family we were. Harold Mitchell. My father was everything a small-town success story should be. At 35, he owned Mitchell Agricultural Supply, drawing customers from 3 counties, with his reputation for fair dealing. He was large, 6'2", built like a linebacker, with steel gray eyes that could shift from warm when joking at Murphy's Diner to calculating when he looked at me with what I would learn was hunger. Harold Mitchell understands discipline and character, Reverend Johnson once told my mother. Those children are lucky to have such strong guidance. If only he knew what Harold's guidance looked like behind closed doors. My mother, Dolores Ann Mitchell, was Harold's perfect complement. Barely 5 feet tall at 28, with dark hair and a flawless bun and wire-rimmed glasses that magnified pale blue eyes. She worked as a seamstress from home, transforming our dining room into a workshop filled with rainbow towers of fabric. Her needlework was exquisite wedding dresses that made brides weep quilts that became heirlooms. She had a habit of humming wordless melodies while working sounds that customers found soothing. "Your mother is such a lady," Mrs. Patterson from the bank often said. "So refined, so proper." What Mrs. Patterson couldn't see was how Dolores's eyes lit up with strange excitement when Harold announced my lessons, or how those gentle hands would later document my suffering in neat handwriting like a scientist recording fascinating experiments. I was born in March 1955 during Kentucky's worst blizzard. Harold joked that I came fighting impossible odds that the storm matched, bringing me into existence. "Should have known she'd be trouble." He'd laugh, the sound sending ice through my veins before I understood why. I was an only child. Medical records later revealed Dolores had suffered 5 miscarriages. I carried the full weight of my parents' attention with no siblings to share Harold's interest or witness what happened in our basement. Harold had finished the basement himself, dark paneling over concrete walls, industrial carpeting, a workshop with tools, and a relaxation area, with wet bar and seating for entertaining friends during football games. To visitors, it looked like any successful businessman's retreat. They couldn't see the hidden camera behind a false panel, the lockbox in his workbench, or how certain carpet sections had been replaced to cover stains no cleaning could eliminate. The basement's single window created eerie shadows during day and oppressive darkness at night. The air always mixed motor oil sawdust, persistent dampness, and something else I couldn't identify until years later, the smell of terror itself. Everything changed that humid August night in 1963 when I was 8 years old. I'd spent the evening catching fireflies in mason jars, watching them pulse with magical light before releasing them into warm darkness. Harold's voice calling me inside carried a different tone, something that made my instincts prickle with anxiety I couldn't name. "Sarah, come here, little mouse. Daddy wants to discuss something important." I found him in the living room, work clothes, unbuttoned, a glass of bourbon, catching lamplight like liquid fire. The sharp scent filled the air with promises of altered behavior. "Sit on Daddy's lap," he said, patting his knee while sipping whiskey. "We need a grown-up conversation." Something felt wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. Harold had never been affectionate, But this invitation carried undertones that made my stomach flutter with nameless dread. As I climbed onto his lap, his arms felt less like embrace, more like trap. His hands, usually rough from work, seemed unnaturally gentle as they settled on my shoulders, trembling with barely controlled excitement. "Sarah," he whispered, voice vibrating through his chest, "you're becoming a big girl. 8 years old, ready to learn special things most children never understand." That's when Dolores appeared like a ghost carrying perfectly popped kernels glistening with butter. She settled into her rocking chair and began eating deliberately. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Her pale eyes fixed on us with intensity that raised goosebumps along my arms. She wasn't watching. She was studying, waiting. "Tonight," Harold continued hypnotically, "we'll teach you about real love, the kind special families share when they trust completely." His hands began moving, sliding from my shoulders with gentleness that felt invasive wrong. When I tried pulling away, his grip tightened, not painful, but firm enough to communicate resistance was futile. "Don't be frightened, little mouse." He breathed into my ear, breath hot and moist. "Daddy would never hurt you. This is how fathers show daughters love, how they prepare them for the world outside our safe family." His massive hands began exploring my small body in ways that made every instinct scream danger, touching places that felt fundamentally private. His fingers violated boundaries I didn't know existed, creating sensations my nervous system registered as profoundly wrong. "Good girl," he murmured as I froze like prey. "Just relax and let Daddy teach you. This is what love feels like when people trust each other completely." I looked desperately toward my mother, hoping for intervention, for maternal instinct to override whatever paralysis gripped her. Instead, I witnessed something that would haunt 47 years of nightmares. Dolores was smiling. Not her polite social expression, but something genuine and deeply pleased. Mama," I whispered, tears streaming as Harold's violation continued. She tilted her head like a bird, considering specimens, speaking in the gentle voice she used, teaching me to bake. "Sweetheart, I know this feels strange initially, but Mama and Daddy know what's best. We're protecting you by teaching special lessons. The world has dangerous people who hurt little girls who don't understand how love really works." Her words were poison wrapped in maternal sweetness, psychological manipulation so subtle my child's mind couldn't recognize it as abuse. She reframed Harold's assault as protection, his violation as education, making me complicit by convincing me it was necessary for safety. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Her methodical popcorn consumption provided surreal accompaniment to Harold's destruction of my innocence. She ate with deliberate pace, occasionally nodding approval, as if Harold demonstrated proper domestic technique. The violation lasted 20 minutes, though terror distorted time into endless eternity. When it ended, Harold lifted me casually, like repositioning furniture rather than a traumatized child. "Now, little mouse," he said, straightening clothes and reaching for bourbon. "You understand why this remains our family's special secret. Not everyone is blessed with parents who love deeply enough to provide this education." I stood, trembling, tears flowing freely, my mind struggling to process what happened, while every cell screamed that something fundamental had shattered. "If you tell anyone about our special lessons," Harold continued gently but underlaid with steel, "terrible things will happen. They'll take you from Mama and Daddy, put you in institutions where children are beaten daily and never receive love. They'll imprison Mama and Daddy for loving you too much, and it'll be entirely your fault for not understanding how precious our family bond is." Dolores leaned forward, magnified eyes piercing my soul. "Darling, people who don't understand special love like ours would call it wrong. They're jealous of families who share everything. They want to destroy what makes us unique. You don't want strangers hurting our family, do you?" I shook my head frantically. Separation from everything familiar more terrifying than what had occurred. The world suddenly seemed full of unimaginable dangers, institutions with beaten children, prisons swallowing my parents, strangers, destroying families. "Excellent," Harold said, patting my head like a successful pet. "Now, prepare for bed. Remember, this is our beautiful secret, something making our family more special than others could understand." That night, lying in my yellow bedroom surrounded by stuffed animals that could no longer comfort me, I knew everything had changed forever. The 8-year-old who caught fireflies was gone, replaced by someone who would spend 5 years learning lessons no child should learn. The weekly family lessons became predictable as Sunday church. Every Saturday evening, Harold would announce education time, and Dolores would prepare her observation materials with ritualistic precision, measuring kernels, heating oil perfectly, adding salt and butter in perfected proportions. The basement transformation happened gradually. Harold installed a brown leather recliner positioned to face the old couch, added thicker window curtains for temperature control, and moved the television downstairs with a locked metal cabinet of educational materials. By my 9th birthday, Harold's curriculum had expanded beyond simple violations. What began with inappropriate touching progressed to acts so degrading, my mind learned to separate from my body, floating near the ceiling, while watching destruction happen to someone who resembled me but couldn't be me. Observe our little student's progress. Harold would tell Dolores, positioning me according to increasingly elaborate plans. She's learning cooperation and understanding her family role. Dolores never simply watched. She participated, actively offering improvement suggestions, providing encouragement during my resistance, physically assisting when Harold needed extra hands. Try adjusting her position leftward, she'd advise in the patient tone she used teaching Sunday school. Remember our discussion about psychological conditioning? Anticipation enhances educational value significantly. Her clinical approach was more horrifying than Harold's obvious excitement. He was appetite-driven monster. She was worse, a scientist studying innocence destruction with detached microscope interest. The recliner became her observation post, positioned for optimal viewing angles. She'd settle like a theater patron popcorn bowl, balanced precisely, pale eyes bright with anticipation. Crunch, crunch, crunch! The sound became my terror's soundtrack, each kernel's destruction marking another moment of my dismantling. She ate deliberately, savoring both snack and Harold's entertainment. Sometimes she'd pause mid-bite for commentary, mouth full, while speaking. "Harold, remember that modification we discussed?" she might say, pointing with butter-slicked fingers. "Sarah's fear response will be much more satisfying from that angle." When I was 10, I found courage through pain and routine degradation. "Daddy, please stop," I whispered barely audibly. "It hurts so much. Please don't do this anymore." Harold's face transformed instantly, gentle, teacher mask slipping to reveal something primitive and vicious. His hand struck my cheek with enough force to ring ears and explode stars across vision. "Oh, what did you say?" he roared, voice echoing like basement thunder. "What did my ungrateful little brat just say?" Blood filled my mouth where teeth cut my cheek, but physical pain paled beside terror flooding my system at seeing Harold's true nature. This wasn't Millbrook's respected businessman or even the controlled predator conducting weekly lessons. This was something feral that might destroy me completely. I just meant," I stammered desperately. "I don't like the lessons. I want them stopping." The second slap snapped my head back with tongue-biting force. Worse than physical assault was Dolores's soft, pleased giggle that crawled revulsion across my skin. She was enjoying this confrontation, this resistance breakdown. Her pale eyes were brighter than ever, leaning forward like theater patrons fearing missed excitement. Dolores stood gracefully, kneeling beside us and bringing her face close. I smelled butter and salt, mixed with something sharp and chemical excitement or madness. "Sarah, honey," she said, voice achingly sweet. "You're hurting Daddy's feelings terribly. He dedicates such time and energy teaching about love and family connection, and this is your gratitude expression." "But Mama," I protested desperately, "it feels bad. Makes me sick and scared." "Mamas should protect little girls from hurtful things." The smile spreading across Dolores's face was the most terrifying thing I'd witnessed. Not polite social expression or gentle maternal smile, this was predatory and hungry, someone finding exactly what they sought. "Oh, sweetheart," she cooed, stroking my hair with trembling fingers. "You don't understand real protection yet. Loving mothers don't shield daughters from learning love, they guide toward proper understanding. They ensure little girls know how to make families truly happy." She glanced at Harold. Wordless communication passed between them, perfect understanding of longtime partners sharing dark secrets. "I believe our student requires remedial education," she said, businesslike, more frightening than Harold's rage. "She's forgotten fundamental respect and gratitude lessons within our family structure." What followed was the most brutal session I'd endured, worsened by Dolores's active participation and running commentary. She didn't just observe, she held my wrists. When Harold needed both hands, whispered encouragement. When I tried dissociating, provided detailed feedback for Harold's future reference. "Notice how she tenses from that direction," she observed analytically. "Try moving slower. Anticipation will make her fear response much more educationally valuable." When it ended, and I lay broken on the moldy mattress, Dolores knelt with tender maternal expression. "Now, do you understand, baby girl?" she asked softly, wiping tears with gentle fingers. "Fighting love only makes everything more difficult for everyone. Daddy and I know what you need to become the woman God intended." I nodded frantically, desperate to prevent another such session. The lesson had been branded into my nervous system with pain and terror, echoing through decades of dreams. Resistance brought escalation, questions brought punishment, and my parents' love was an escapeless prison. From that night forward, I became Harold's ideal student. I learned perfect stillness during assaults, making no sounds disturbing his concentration, accepting whatever degradation he chose with broken doll compliance. Dolores praised my improvement, regularly commenting with teacher pride, whose struggling pupil had finally mastered difficult material. "She's becoming such a cooperative little girl," she'd tell Harold after successful sessions. "So understanding of her family place. I believe she's ready for advanced instruction soon." The advanced lessons began at 11, involving equipment Harold brought in unmarked boxes and techniques requiring both parents' participation. The recliner no longer sufficed for Dolores's needs, she required closer proximity, more direct education involvement. During these extended sessions, lasting hours on weekend afternoons, while neighboring families attended church, I learned complete body departure. My consciousness would float near the basement ceiling, watching destruction happen to a girl resembling me, but who couldn't actually be me because surviving this violation level was impossible for real people. From elevated perspective, I observed Harold and Dolores with anthropologist detachment studying savage tribes. They moved around my body with practiced efficiency, discussing techniques like stage directors blocking complex scenes. Their faces showed excitement and concentration reminiscent of children with new toys, absorbed, focused, completely indifferent to the toy's suffering capacity. "Try positioning her differently." Dolores would suggest adjusting my limbs with flower-arranging casualness. "Yes, much better. The camera angle will be perfect from there." Camera angle. Words registered in floating consciousness without immediate comprehension, filed with other overheard conversation fragments, seeming important but incomprehensible. Months would pass before understanding what camera she referenced, years before discovering Harold and Dolores's documentation project's full scope. Even dissociated, some part recorded everything, every word, expression, detail that might someday become evidence if I survived long enough. That hidden part, refusing complete breakage regardless of their actions, began keeping detailed internal crime inventory. This mental catalog became foundation for the diary I started keeping in school notebook margins, cryptic entries resembling random doodling to casual observers, but containing complete records of Harold and Dolores's systematic innocence destruction. November 15, 1966, Advanced Lesson, per 3. H used new locked box equipment. D took special notebook notes. Session lasted 2 hours, 17 minutes. They discussed expanding the program after Christmas. December 8, 1966, D measured my responses with stopwatch. H asked if I was ready for the next phase. D said not yet but soon. They're planning something bigger. January 22, 1967, discovered camera angle, meaning H has been filming everything. D keeps tapes locked in sewing room cabinet behind fabric samples. Counted at least 20 tapes marked with dates and numbers. Harold's filming operation discovery added new horror dimensions to weekly ordeals. Every violation had been recorded, preserved for future viewing pleasure, or purposes too young to imagine. Knowledge that strangers might someday watch my destruction, that my pain might entertain other Harold and Dolores monsters, made me feel exposed and vulnerable in ways transcending physical assaults. But it also provided something I'd never had: concrete proof of their actions. The tapes were evidence documentation, undismissible as troubled child fantasies or attention-seeking lies. If I could access those recordings and deliver them to people with stopping power, I might save myself and prevent them from destroying other children. By my 12th birthday, in March 1967, it was clear I wouldn't be their only victim forever. Dolores had begun commenting about expanding our educational program and sharing our specialized knowledge with other families benefiting from our experience. She spoke about certain community children with the same analytical interest, once reserved for fabric patterns, evaluating potential, discussing vulnerabilities, planning recruitment into whatever sick network Harold and Dolores were building. When I turned 13 in March 1968, something fundamental crystallized inside my fractured psyche. The terrified child who had endured Harold and Dolores's weekly lessons for nearly 5 years remained cowering in my mind's deepest corners, but she'd been joined by something else. A cold, analytical observer watching everything with scientist detachment, studying fascinating specimens. This new personality aspect began noticing things the frightened child had been too overwhelmed to catalog: how Harold's breathing patterns changed during different assault types, how Dolores's note-taking became frantic when I showed certain fear responses, the careful equipment cleaning and organization after each session. Most importantly, this analytical self understood that Harold and Dolores weren't just satisfying sick appetites. They were building something, creating something, preparing for Operation Expansion, involving other children. The realization crystallized during a particularly brutal late March session, days after my 13th birthday. Harold had been drinking more heavily than usual, celebrating some business success with his favorite bourbon, and his movements were sloppier, more aggressive than typical controlled precision. "Tonight, little mouse," he slurred while dragging me toward basement stairs, his massive hand clamped around my wrist hard enough for bruises. "We're trying something special. Something we've saved for when you were mature enough to truly appreciate it." The basement felt different that evening, charged with electric tension, raising goosebumps despite warm spring weather above. Harold had made modifications during my school week: new lighting, casting harsher shadows, additional equipment arranged with military precision, and most ominously what appeared to be professional video camera mounted on corner tripod. As Harold began his assault, more violent and degrading than previous sessions, I looked toward Dolores, expecting usual clinical observation from the brown leather recliner. Instead, I witnessed something shattering my last illusions about my parents' true nature. Dolores wasn't just watching anymore. She was actively participating, offering real-time Harold coaching, adjusting camera angles for better documentation, and most horrifyingly clearly, enjoying every destruction moment with intensity, making her previous enthusiasm seem restrained. "Yes, that's absolutely perfect," she whispered, voice thick with excitement while manipulating camera controls. The terror in her eyes is exquisite. Maintain that position while I optimize lighting. But what she said next, speaking to Harold, as if I weren't present, revealed their plan's true scope. This footage will be ideal for the Morrison demonstration, she said, referring to Jenny Morrison, the preacher's innocent 8-year-old daughter, with blonde pigtails and gap-toothed smile. Her parents are so wonderfully naive, so trusting. When we show them how beautifully Sarah has developed under our guidance, they'll be eager to enroll Jenny in our program. Words struck like physical blows, each syllable carrying implications my 13-year-old mind could barely process. They weren't just planning to abuse Jenny Morrison, they intended using my abuse documentation to convince her parents that what they offered was beneficial service, an educational opportunity helping their daughter develop properly. And the Walsh boy shows excellent potential as well, Harold grunted between exertions. His father's drinking problem makes the family extremely vulnerable. They'd probably pay us to remove him for weekend sessions. Tommy Walsh. A quiet boy in my grade, already showing neglect signs and emotional damage from his father's alcoholism. Harold and Dolores had been studying him, evaluating vulnerabilities, planning recruitment into their sick network. With methodical care they brought to all projects. As the assault continued, with Dolores providing running camera commentary and Harold following her increasingly detailed instructions, I made a decision, changing everything. Instead of escaping into dissociated states that had protected my sanity during previous sessions, I forced myself to remain present, witnessing and memorizing every detail. Every spoken word, every employed technique, every equipment piece. I cataloged it all with desperate intensity of someone whose survival depended on perfect recall. If I was going to save Jenny Morrison and Tommy Walsh, and God knew how many other children Harold and Dolores were targeting, I needed evidence. Real, undeniable proof, undismissible as troubled teenager fantasies. The session finally ended after what felt like hours of systematic degradation designed specifically for maximum camera impact. Harold and Dolores began usual cleanup routine, but this time, instead of simply wiping down equipment and straightening furniture, they engaged in detailed post-session analysis, revealing their operation's full professional scope. The new lighting setup worked perfectly. Dolores observed, reviewing footage on small television connected to camera. Image quality is significantly clearer than our previous recordings. This should edit together beautifully with demonstration materials we've been preparing. Harold nodded approvingly while organizing tools with military precision. The Louisville clients are paying premium prices for this documentation quality. Once we start accepting local children, we can offer live sessions for even higher fees. Clients, live sessions, premium prices. Business terminology made my stomach lurch with new understanding of what Harold and Dolores had built in our basement. This wasn't just about their gratification. This was commercial enterprise, a business model based on systematic innocence destruction. How many families have responded positively to our initial contacts? Harold asked, consulting a notebook I recognized as one of Dolores's sewing journals. 7 so far, she replied with obvious pride. The Morrisons are most promising, completely trusting, no suspicious methodology questions. The Walshes will require more finesse because of the father's drinking, but their desperation makes them vulnerable to proper approaches. As they continued business discussion, treating my abuse as just another product line for optimization and expansion, I lay on the moldy mattress pretending to be as broken and compliant as they believed. Inside, however, something hard and determined was crystallizing, a pure rage core that Harold and Dolores hadn't touched despite 5 years of systematic violation. They had made crucial mistakes, allowing me to witness their planning session. Now, I knew this operation extended far beyond our basement, that other children were in immediate danger, and that Harold and Dolores saw themselves as entrepreneurs rather than simple predators. More importantly, I knew they had become overconfident, so convinced of my complete submission that they no longer bothered hiding their true activities from me. That overconfidence would become their downfall. Over following weeks, I implemented careful intelligence-gathering operations designed to document Harold and Dolores's crimes' full scope. During assigned basement cleaning duties chores they'd given me as part of my rehabilitation from months' earlier resistance, I conducted systematic equipment and record searches. The hidden compartment behind Harold's workbench yielded evidence treasures exceeding my worst expectations. Photograph boxes documented not just my own abuse over years, but systematic violation of other children as well. Some I recognized from our community kids who had mysteriously stopped attending school for extended periods or who had returned from family trips with new behavioral problems and haunted expressions. But the most damning evidence came from Harold's correspondence files, revealing their network's true scope. Letters, phone numbers, and detailed records showed connections to similar operations in Louisville, Nashville, Atlanta, and other major southern cities. Harold and Dolores weren't just local predators, they were part of an organized network trading children techniques and documentation across state lines. Financial records showed payments received for consulting services, educational materials, and specialized training programs. Harold had been earning significant income from basement activities, money, explaining how a small-town equipment dealer could afford expensive cameras, lighting, and other professional-grade equipment I'd observed during recent sessions. Most chilling were Dolores's planning notebooks written in neat teacher handwriting and organized with methodical precision she brought to sewing projects. Page after page detailed potential victim psychological profiles, step-by-step recruitment strategies for vulnerable families, and technical conditioning technique. Discussions designed to break children's resistance as efficiently as possible. But then, I discovered something that explained everything about Dolores's twisted psychology, her own childhood diary, hidden in a sewing box that had belonged to her mother. The diary, penned in the meticulous handwriting of a young girl, chronicled years of deliberate torment inflicted by Dolores's father and uncle, with her mother's complete awareness and complicity. Yet what proved more haunting than the abuse itself was the way Dolores had processed and absorbed these traumatic experiences into her understanding of the world. June 15, 1942. Daddy explained today why our family lessons are necessary. He says the world is full of dangerous men who hurt little girls who don't understand how to make them happy. By teaching me the right way to act, he's protecting me from worse things that could happen. I'm starting to understand how special our family love is. August 3, 1942. Mama watched our lesson today and told me afterward how proud she is of how I'm learning. She said most little girls fight against love because they don't understand it yet. But I'm getting smarter. She's right. Fighting just makes everything hurt more. It's better to accept what Daddy needs from me. Page after page revealed not just abuse, but systematic, psychological conditioning that had convinced young Dolores that sexual exploitation was protection, that compliance was wisdom, that what most people would call rape was actually love. Morrison Jennifer, age 8. Parents, extremely religious father, travels frequently for church conferences. Mother, isolated, desperate for community acceptance. Approach through women's auxiliary offer, special tutoring for gifted children. Father's absence provides optimal access windows. Walsh Thomas, age 11. Father's alcoholism creates family chaos. Mother works double shifts for financial compensation. Child shows existing neglect and emotional damage signs. Offer mentorship program through Harold's community connections. Existing trauma makes conditioning process significantly easier. Reading these clinical evaluations of children, I knew children who trusted adults and believed the world was fundamentally safe, filled me with rage so pure and focused, it burned away my childhood fear's last remnants. Harold and Dolores weren't just monsters, they were predators with systematic plans for destroying innocence on industrial scales. But they had made one crucial planning error. They had underestimated their primary victim's capacity for survival and resistance. The 13-year-old girl they thought they'd broken completely was actually gathering evidence that would destroy them. My opportunity came in May 1968 when Harold announced he would attend a 3-day agricultural equipment convention in Louisville. This was my chance to gather physical evidence I needed and find a way to get it to authorities who could act. On the first morning after Harold's departure, while Dolores was occupied with an elaborate wedding dress commission requiring her complete sewing room attention, I implemented the plan I'd been refining for weeks. Armed with Harold's own camera, a device I'd learned to operate by watching him document my abuse, I began photographing the most damning evidence from his collection. The process required hours of careful work, photographing documents and correspondence proving the network's existence, recording video equipment serial numbers, and documenting financial records showing this was profitable business rather than individual sickness. My hands shook constantly, both from discovery fear and from emotional impact of handling evidence detailing such systematic evil. Most difficult was reviewing Harold's video collection to identify recordings containing other children's abuse evidence. Watching footage of my own violations was traumatic enough, but seeing other children, some younger than I'd been when Harold first assaulted me, experiencing the same systematic destruction was almost more than my 13-year-old psyche could handle. But it was also proof I needed that this went far beyond our basement in Millbrook, Kentucky. Harold and Dolores were part of something bigger requiring federal law enforcement intervention to stop completely. As I worked documenting crime after crime with methodical precision, I could hear Dolores in her sewing room humming those wordless melodies that had provided soundtrack to my destruction for so many years. The sound that once filled me with dread now felt like countdown timer, each note bringing me closer to having enough evidence to destroy the monsters who had stolen my childhood. But just as I prepared to photograph the last correspondence batch, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Harold's truck pulling into our driveway, engine rumbling with the distinctive diesel note I'd learned to fear during 5 years of basement lessons. He had returned a full day early from his convention. "Sarah!" His voice boomed through the house as the kitchen door slammed shut. "Where's my little mouse?" I had perhaps 30 seconds before he would begin systematic house searches looking for me with methodical thoroughness he brought to all projects. The basement was a trap. If he found me there with his evidence scattered across the workbench, there would be no explanation that could save me from punishment, making previous sessions seem gentle by comparison. With shaking hands, I gathered the most crucial photographs and documents, stuffing them into a manila envelope I clutched against my chest like a shield. Harold's remaining collection I returned to its hiding place as quickly as possible, hoping my hasty reorganization wouldn't reveal someone had been searching through his materials. Harold's boots on basement stairs reached my ears just as I dove under his workbench, pressing my body into the narrow space between concrete wall and metal cabinet where he stored tools. The evidence envelope was trapped beneath me, sharp corners digging into my ribs, but I didn't dare move even slightly for fear of making noise revealing my location. "I know you're down here somewhere." Harold's voice carried new suspicion edge that made my heart hammer against my ribcage so hard I was certain he could hear it. "Your mother said you were cleaning, but I don't see work evidence being done." His boots moved across the basement floor with deliberate slowness, pausing at each potential hiding spot while he conducted thorough searches. The sound grew closer until I could see his work boots' steel toes just inches from my face. "When I find you," he said softly, his voice carrying quiet menace infinitely more terrifying than shouting, "we're going to have a very long discussion about trust and respect, and what happens to little girls who sneak around where they don't belong." I held my breath until my lungs burned, fighting the urge to gasp for air, while Harold's boots remained stationed directly in front of my hiding place. Time stretched into eternity, each second feeling like an hour, as I waited for his massive hand to reach into shadows and drag me into light for punishment my imagination couldn't begin to encompass. Then salvation arrived in Harold's business phone, ringing upstairs, a major client call requiring his immediate attention and drawing him away from the basement before he could complete his search. I waited until I heard his voice on the phone, above discussing delivery schedules and equipment specifications, before allowing myself to breathe again. But I knew my time had run out. Harold's suspicions had been aroused by finding me absent from assigned cleaning duties. and he would undoubtedly conduct more thorough searches once his business call ended. I had perhaps 15 minutes to escape the house with my evidence before he returned to finish what he'd started. The 30-mile journey to the county seat became the longest walk of my 13-year-old life. Each step carried me farther from home than I'd ever traveled alone, while the manila envelope pressed against my chest like a talisman, both reassuring and terrifying. Inside were photographs proving an organized predator network financial records, showing profitable enterprise, and most damning of all, still images I'd captured from Harold's video collection documenting multiple children's abuse across several states. I chose back roads winding through tobacco farms and horse pastures, avoiding main highways where Harold might search in his truck. Every distant engine sound made me dive behind roadside bushes, heart pounding with terror that Harold had discovered my absence and was hunting me. But I also carried something that gave me strength, the knowledge that Jenny Morrison and Tommy Walsh would be safe because of my courage. I rehearsed the words I would use to explain Harold and Dolores's crimes. At 13, I lacked vocabulary to describe many specific acts they'd forced me to endure, but I had evidence to support whatever explanations I could manage. The state police barracks sat on the county seat's outskirts, a modern brick building looking nothing like Millbrook's small-town sheriff's office, where Harold's reputation might carry weight. This was where I needed to be, away from Harold's influence, speaking to professionals specializing in serious crimes. Sergeant Patricia Walsh was working the front desk when I pushed through glass doors, my clothes dusty from the long walk, and my face streaked with tears. I hadn't realized I was crying. She was a woman in her 40s, with graying hair pulled back in a neat bun and kind eyes that immediately focused on my obvious distress. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" she asked, coming around the desk to kneel in front of me with practiced efficiency of someone who had dealt with traumatized children before. "My parents," I said, words feeling like broken glass in my throat. "They've been hurting me for years, and they're planning to hurt other children too." Something in my tone, or perhaps the careful way I clutched the manila envelope, convinced Sergeant Walsh this wasn't typical family dispute or adolescent rebellion. She led me to a private interview room and called for Detective James Crawford, a tall man with graying hair who specialized in crimes against children. "Tell us what's been happening, Sarah," Detective Crawford said, gently settling into a chair across from me, while Sergeant Walsh positioned herself nearby with a notepad. For the first time in 5 years of hell, I told complete truth to adults who had power to act on it. Words came out in a torrent, 5 years of systematic abuse documentation and commercial exploitation pouring out of me like water from a broken dam. I told them about basement lessons, about Dolores's active participation and planning, about the predator network Harold corresponded with, about immediate plans to recruit Jenny Morrison and Tommy Walsh into their program. "The most important thing you need to understand," I said, my voice growing stronger as I spoke, "is that my mother isn't just watching. She's the one planning everything. She has notebooks where she writes down how to hurt children better, how to make them too scared to fight back. She told Harold exactly what to do to me, and she's been planning to do the same things to other kids in our town." Neither officer interrupted my account or showed disbelief signs. They took careful notes, asked clarifying questions when my explanations became confused, and maintained professional composure that made me feel heard and believed rather than judged. When I finished my verbal account, Detective Crawford leaned forward intently. "Sarah, what you're describing is extremely serious. These are very grave accusations. Do you have any evidence to support what you're telling us?" With trembling hands, I gave him the manila envelope containing evidence I'd gathered. His expression grew progressively grimmer as he examined each photograph and document, understanding immediately that this case extended far beyond simple child abuse into organized criminal enterprise. "Jesus Christ!" he whispered, studying financial records showing Harold's income from basement activities. This is industrial-scale child exploitation." He looked up at me with eyes filled with compassion and professional determination. "Sarah, I want you to know how incredibly brave you've been. What you've done here gathering this evidence, finding courage to come forward, this could save dozens of children's lives. Well, what happens now? I asked, suddenly terrified of what my courage might have set in motion. Harold's threats about orphanages and broken families echoed in my mind, even though I intellectually understood they'd been lies designed to maintain control. And now, Detective Crawford said with steel in his voice, we make sure Harold and Dolores Mitchell never hurt another child. And we dismantle the entire network they've been part of. The conversation was interrupted by the interview room door bursting open. Harold stood there, his face flushed red with rage, his massive frame filling the doorway like an avenging demon. There you are, he snarled, his eyes fixed on me with pure hatred. I should have known you'd run here with your lies and fantasies. Come on, Sarah. We're going home right now. Detective Crawford immediately stepped between Harold and me, his hand moving to his service weapon. Sir, you need to step back and identify yourself. I'm Harold Mitchell, and that's my daughter. Harold said, his voice taking on the reasonable tone he used when dealing with customers. I don't know what stories she's been telling you, but Sarah has always had an overactive imagination. She's been having some behavioral problems lately, and I think she's seeking attention. Mr. Mitchell, Sergeant Walsh said, standing up with her own hand near her weapon, your daughter has made some very serious allegations. We're going to need to speak with you about them. Harold's facade began to crack. Allegations. What kind of allegations? That little bitch has been nothing but trouble since the day she was born. After everything Dolores and I have done for her, this is how she repays us. Sir, I'm going to need you to calm down, Detective Crawford said firmly. And I'm going to need you to come with us for questioning. That's when Harold's mask slipped completely. His reasonable businessman persona evaporated, revealing the monster beneath. You have no idea what you're dealing with, he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. That girl is mine. She belongs to me and Dolores. We made her what she is, and we can unmake her just as easily. You have no right to interfere with our family. Actually, we do, Detective Crawford replied, producing handcuffs. Harold Mitchell, you're under arrest for suspicion of child sexual abuse and conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent. The next few hours were a blur of activity. While Harold was processed and booked, teams of officers executed search warrants on our house and Harold's business. What they found exceeded even my worst descriptions. Meanwhile, I remained at the police station wrapped in a blanket and sipping hot chocolate that Sergeant Walsh had brought me. As evening fell, Detective Crawford returned with updates that made my head spin. Sarah, he said, sitting down across from me, I need you to understand something. What you uncovered today, it's bigger than we could have imagined. We found evidence of a criminal network operating across 4 states. Harold and Dolores weren't just abusing you. They were part of an organized ring that's been trafficking children for commercial exploitation. What about my mother? I asked. Did you arrest her too? Detective Crawford's expression grew grim. Yes, we did. And Sarah, I have to tell you something that might be difficult to hear. When we confronted your mother with the evidence, she didn't deny anything. In fact, she seemed almost proud of what she'd done. He paused, choosing his words carefully. She told our officers that she was protecting you by preparing you for what she called the reality of being female. She said she learned from her own childhood that fighting against abuse only makes it worse, so she was teaching you to accept it gracefully. The words hit me like a physical blow. Even knowing what Dolores had done, some part of me had still hoped she might show remorse, might recognize the horror of what she'd participated in. She's sick, isn't she? I asked quietly. Really, truly sick? Yes, Detective Crawford replied gently. We found your mother's childhood diary among the evidence. What happened to her as a child? It broke something inside her mind. But Sarah, that doesn't excuse what she did to you. Understanding why someone commits a crime doesn't make the crime any less serious. As night fell over the police station, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 5 years, genuine hope that the nightmare was finally ending. But I also understood that the hardest part still lay ahead. There would be a trial testimony reliving every detail of my abuse in front of strangers. There would be the challenge of building a new life, learning to trust again, finding a way to heal from wounds that went deeper than physical scars. But for the first time since that August night when Harold first called me his little mouse, I believed that healing was actually possible. The monsters had been captured. The truth had been told. Other children would be safe, and somewhere beyond the basement, Shadow's mountain light was waiting to warm my face and help me grow into the woman I was meant to become. The trial began 18 months later in November 1969, drawing national media attention as details of Harold and Dolores's criminal network became public knowledge. By then, I was living with Tom and Margaret Henderson in Asheville, North Carolina, distant relatives of my beloved teacher, Mrs. Henderson, who had quietly suspected something was wrong and reached out when news of the arrests broke. The Hendersons were everything my biological parents weren't: gentle, patient, genuinely loving. Tom was a high school principal who had dedicated his career to helping troubled teenagers, while Margaret was a psychiatric nurse with extensive experience working with trauma survivors. Sarah, Margaret told me during my first week in their home as I sat rigid with fear during what should have been a comforting family dinner. You don't have to earn your place here. You don't have to be perfect or grateful or anything other than yourself. You're safe now, and that safety isn't conditional on your behavior. It would take months before I could truly believe those words, longer still, before I could accept physical affection without flinching. But the Hendersons' consistency and patience slowly convinced me that not all adults were predators waiting for opportunities to exploit vulnerable children. District Attorney Margaret Coleman, a fierce prosecutor in her 40s who had built her reputation on complex child exploitation cases, prepared me carefully for what would be the most difficult experience of my young life. Sarah, she said during one of our preparation sessions, I know testifying is going to be incredibly hard. You'll have to relive some of the worst experiences of your life in front of strangers. But I want you to remember that every word you speak could prevent another child from suffering what you endured. The courtroom was packed when my day to testify arrived. I was 15 years old and terrified, but I also carried the strength of knowing that Jenny Morrison and Tommy Walsh were safe because of my courage. They sat in the gallery with their families, living proof that speaking truth could prevent unimaginable suffering. Please state your name for the record. D.A. Coleman began gently. Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell. I said, my voice shaking slightly but growing stronger with each word. I'm 15 years old, and Harold and Dolores Mitchell are my biological parents. For the next 6 hours spread across 3 days of testimony, I told them everything. I described the progression of abuse from that first August night when I was 8 to the systematic commercial exploitation I had discovered by age 13. I explained Harold's techniques and Dolores's active participation, the documentation they had created, the network of predators they worked with, and their plans to recruit other local children. The most difficult part was explaining Dolores's role to people who couldn't understand how a mother could orchestrate her own daughter's abuse. My mother wasn't just watching what my father did to me. I explained to the jury, my voice steady despite the tears streaming down my face. She was the one planning it all. She kept detailed notes about how to hurt me more effectively. She suggested new ways for my father to abuse me. She even participated physically when he needed help restraining me. I pulled out the diary I had been keeping since I was 10 years old. Pages and pages of detailed accounts written in a child's hand, complete with dates, times, and descriptions that corroborated every aspect of my testimony. I wrote it all down. I said, my voice no longer shaking, filled instead with quiet determination. Every date, every time, every word they said to me. Because even when I was little, I knew what they were doing to me was wrong, and I knew someday I would need proof. The defense attorneys tried every strategy to discredit my testimony. They suggested I was lying for attention, that I had been coached by prosecutors, that my accounts were fantasies created by inappropriate books and movies. But when they questioned the specifics of my story, the physical evidence spoke louder than any doubts they could raise. The most devastating moment came when prosecutors presented the contents of Harold's hidden collection and Dolores's planning notebooks. The photographs, videos, correspondence, and financial records painted an undeniable picture of systematic child exploitation operating as a profitable business enterprise. But it was the revelation of Dolores's own childhood diary that provided the most chilling insight into her psychology. The courtroom fell silent as passages were read, describing how a little girl's mind had been systematically warped to believe that sexual abuse was love and protection. The defendant, Dolores Mitchell, was herself a victim of severe childhood attack, the prosecutor explained to the jury. But instead of seeking help or breaking the cycle, she embraced the abuse as normal and even beneficial. She genuinely believed that by subjecting her daughter to systematic exploitation, she was preparing her for what she saw as the inevitable reality of being female. Dr. Elizabeth Hartley, the psychiatrist who had evaluated Dolores, took the stand to explain the psychological mechanisms that had created such a twisted worldview. Mrs. Mitchell suffers from what we call identification with the aggressor, Dr. Hartley testified. When children are systematically abused over long periods, especially with psychological manipulation that frames the abuse as love or protection, they sometimes develop the belief that the abuse is not only normal, but beneficial. In Mrs. Mitchell's case, this belief became so entrenched that she was unable to recognize that her actions toward her daughter constituted abuse rather than protection. But she seemed to enjoy watching my father hurt me, I had told Dr. Hartley during one of our evaluation sessions. She took notes, suggested improvements, participated actively. How is that protection? That's the most tragic aspect, Dr. Hartley had replied gently. Your mother genuinely believed she was protecting you by preparing you for what she saw as inevitable. In her distorted worldview, teaching you to submit to sexual abuse wasn't cruelty, it was survival training. The revelation added another layer of horror to the case. The understanding that monsters are often made rather than born, that abuse creates cycles spanning generations, unless someone finds courage to break them. When the verdicts came in after 4 days of deliberation, Harold was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Dolores received 60 years with the possibility of parole after 45 years, the lesser sentence reflecting the jury's recognition of her own victimization, while still holding her accountable for her crimes against me. Judge Catherine Roberts, an elderly woman who had presided over family court for decades, had tears in her eyes as she delivered the sentences. In 40 years on this bench, Judge Roberts said, her voice thick with emotion, I have never encountered such calculated, systematic cruelty disguised as love and protection. The defendant's actions represent not just individual crimes, but the perpetuation of generational trauma that could have continued indefinitely if not for their victims' extraordinary courage in speaking truth. She turned to look directly at Harold and Dolores. You took an innocent child and tried to destroy her soul for your own gratification and profit. You documented her suffering for commercial purposes. You plan to do the same to other children in your community. The court finds that your actions represent such a fundamental betrayal of the parent-child relationship that no mercy is warranted. As the bailiffs led my parents away in shackles, Harold turned and looked at me one last time. There was no apology in his eyes, no recognition of wrongdoing, only pure, undiluted hatred for the daughter who had dared to speak truth about his crimes. This isn't over, he mouthed silently, his lips forming words I could read but not hear. Dolores's reaction was somehow even more disturbing. As she passed my seat in the gallery, she smiled at me with that same gentle expression I remembered from before the basement, before the lessons, before everything had gone wrong. I love you, baby girl, she called out softly, as if this were all some terrible misunderstanding that would eventually be resolved. I always did everything for your own good. Even in defeat, even facing decades in prison, she still couldn't recognize that what she had called love was actually systematic destruction. The years following the trial were a journey through landscapes of healing I hadn't known existed. Living with Tom and Margaret Henderson, I slowly learned what normal family life could look like. Meals without hidden agendas, conversations without psychological manipulation, physical affection without ulterior motives. The process wasn't easy. I flinched when touched unexpectedly, even by people I trusted. Loud noises sent me into panic attacks that could last for hours. The smell of popcorn or the sound of humming would transport me back to that basement, leaving me shaking and disoriented until Margaret's gentle voice could guide me back to the present. Healing isn't linear. Dr. Sarah Goldberg, my therapist, explained during one of our sessions when I was frustrated by what felt like lack of progress. You're not trying to forget what happened to you that's impossible and not even desirable. You're learning to carry those experiences without letting them define your entire life. Dr. Goldberg specialized in childhood trauma and had extensive experience with survivors of systematic abuse. Her office became my sanctuary, a place where I could speak the unspeakable and work through emotions that had been trapped inside me for years. It was during this period that I discovered art therapy. When traditional talk therapy felt overwhelming, I could express emotions through drawing, painting, and eventually sculpting. My breakthrough came when I was 17 and working with clay for the first time. Sometimes, my art teacher, Mr. Rodriguez, had said, "Our hands know how to heal what our minds can't reach." The moment I touched wet clay, something awakened in me that I hadn't known existed. I could shape it, control. It transformed something formless into something beautiful. My favorite subjects became birds, small songbirds that reminded me that survival was possible, that even after the harshest winter's spring would come and creatures would sing again. I chose to attend UNC Asheville, staying close to the Hendersons, who had become my real family. I majored in psychology with a minor in art therapy, driven by a growing desire to help other survivors of childhood trauma. It was during my junior year that I met David Chen, a graduate student in social work, who was passionate about child advocacy. David was everything Harold had not been: gentle, patient, respectful, and genuinely kind. Our relationship developed, slowly built on trust and understanding, rather than fear and control. When I finally told David about my childhood, his response was perfect in its simplicity. "Thank you for trusting me with something so important. Whatever happened to you doesn't change how I see you. You're intelligent, talented, kind, and incredibly strong. That's who you are." We dated for 3 years before I felt ready for marriage, and even longer before physical intimacy became possible without triggering flashbacks. David never pressured me, never made me feel broken when I had episodes that required us to stop. "We have forever to figure this out," he would say, holding me as I recovered from traumatic memories. "There's no timeline we have to follow except your own." We married in May 1979, and I truly believed that the worst was behind me. But life had other plans. David and I both wanted children desperately, but the years of severe physical abuse had left internal damage that made pregnancy dangerous, if not impossible. "I'm sorry," Dr. Martinez said gently as she showed us test results. The trauma was extensive and occurred during crucial developmental years. Pregnancy would pose significant risks, and conception itself is unlikely. We tried adoption, but my history of abuse raised red flags with agencies. Despite being the victim, social workers worried about cycles of abuse and questioned whether I could provide a stable home environment. "Maybe we're meant to help children in different ways," I told David after years of rejection letters. And that's exactly what we did. David became a child protective investigator while I used my psychology and art therapy background to work with traumatized children. The work was demanding, but deeply fulfilling. I specialized in helping children who had experienced sexual abuse using art therapy techniques to help them process trauma too overwhelming for words. One of my young clients was 7-year-old Emma, whose father had been abusing her while her mother blamed her for seducing him. "Miss Sarah," Emma asked during a pottery session, "do you think I'll ever feel happy again?" "I know you will," I told her, helping her shape a small clay bird. "It might take time and it might feel impossible right now, but happiness is still inside you. We just have to help it remember how to fly." 6 months later, Emma was placed with a loving foster family. At our final session, she gave me a drawing of 2 birds flying together under a rainbow. "That's you and me," she explained proudly. "We both learned how to fly again." In 2003, when I was 48 years old, I received a call that brought the past crashing back into my present. Dolores was eligible for parole after serving 34 years. The hearing was held at the Women's Correctional Facility where she'd been incarcerated. At 73, she looked fragile and harmless. But when our eyes met, I saw that same spark from the basement sessions, someone who had enjoyed watching suffering and would do so again given opportunity. When called to give my victim impact statement, I stood and spoke directly to the parole board. "My name is Sarah Elizabeth Henderson. 40 years ago, when I was 8 years old, the woman sitting in this room began actively participating in systematic attack that would define my childhood for 5 years. I spoke for 30 minutes about what Dolores had done, what she had planned for other children, and what she truly was beneath her facade of victimization. I want this board to understand that Dolores Mitchell wasn't a victim of my father's abuse. She was his partner, his co-conspirator, his equal in planning and implementing crimes against children. Her own childhood victimization explains her psychology, but doesn't excuse her actions." The board denied parole. Dolores would serve at least another 7 years. As we prepared to leave, Dolores was led past our table in shackles. She paused and looked at me with that unsettling smile. "I'm still proud of how strong you became, baby girl," she said sweetly. "Even though you're telling lies about me now, I still love you more than anyone else ever could." Her dismissal of my testimony as lies was her final attempt at psychological control. "You are nothing to me," I replied calmly. "You lost the right to call yourself my mother the first time you chose to watch Harold hurt me instead of protecting me." Walking out with David's arm around me, I felt something I had never experienced: complete closure. Today, at 68, I live in the Blue Ridge Mountains with David surrounded by ceramic birds that sing silently of survival and hope. My pottery studio catches the morning light, and I teach other survivors that healing is not just possible, but inevitable when you refuse to let monsters define your worth. Harold died in prison in 2016, never expressing remorse. Dolores remains incarcerated, denied parole multiple times for refusing to acknowledge her crime's seriousness. The network was completely dismantled. 12 other adults convicted, over 30 targeted children protected. Jenny Morrison became a prosecutor specializing in crimes against children. Tommy Walsh became a social worker helping at-risk youth. My courage to speak created ripples of protection that continue today. I never forgave Harold and Dolores, and I never will. But I learned something more important: their actions don't have to define my life. Forgiveness isn't necessary for healing. What was necessary was refusing to let their evil determine my worth, my capacity for joy, my ability to love and be loved. Every morning, when I wake up in my safe, beautiful home surrounded by art that speaks to hope and resilience, I remember that 8-year-old girl trapped in Harold's web. I wish I could tell her, "You will survive. You will escape. You will heal. You will help others heal. You will build a life more beautiful than anything you can imagine." Since I can't comfort that little girl, I comfort the ones I meet today. In my pottery classes, my books, my conversations with survivors, I carry the message that saved my life. You are not what happened to you. You are not broken beyond repair. You are worthy of love, safety, and happiness. The monsters can't win if you refuse to let them define you. And somewhere out there, if there's another child living in their own basement of horrors, I want them to know Help is coming. People will believe you. You will survive. The beautiful life you can't imagine yet is waiting. Your voice matters. Your truth matters. Your life matters. And you are going to make it through. In the mountains of North Carolina, birds sing every morning, regardless of how cold and dark the night was. They remind me daily that light always follows darkness, that hope is stronger than despair, and that even the smallest voices can carry the most powerful songs of survival.